So over the weekend, I went and saw Violent Night, which stars David Harbour as Santa Claus, and I gotta say, this was one of the most entertaining, hilarious, and violent modern day holiday movies I've seen in a long time. I had a great time. It did slow down a little bit at some parts, and there was a point where I felt the movie could have ended and it went on just a little bit too long, but overall, David Harbour, he kicks ass. All the supporting characters, they worked, even the little girl, and I like the rapport she had with David Harbour in the film, and David Leitch and company there behind this movie, so you know they put their foot into the action in this movie, and great ode to Home Alone. It had an honest take on Home Alone with some of the traps, and yeah, so Violent Night, if you haven't seen it, go out, go see it. Great movie to watch for the holidays, especially for adults, and yeah. The long-awaited sequel to Avatar called Avatar: The Way of Water was released in theaters over the weekend, and I watched it. Now, if you saw my review of the first Avatar when it was re-released in theaters back in September, you know how I feel about it. I think it's an okay movie. I do appreciate it as a visual and technical spectacle now, but story-wise, But as for this movie, and while I still think we didn't need any Avatar sequels, I do like that James Cameron he basically made this like the first part of an ongoing story, because by the end of the movie there's definitely some stones left unturned. And of course the visuals, hey, you gotta praise the visual effects artists that worked on this movie. And James Cameron, he really put his foot into this movie from a visual and technical spectacle, because my God, from the water, the trees, the plants, even the freaking dreads on the Na'vi, James Cameron is very immaculate when it comes to attention to detail. So I appreciate James Cameron for that. But story-wise, it was entertaining at best, though I will say, like, the first 30 minutes, you really start to feel the runtime. And but it really doesn't get going until like halfway through the movie. But that last hour of the movie is just action-packed, and it was like James Cameron's greatest hits all into that climax of the movie. And so I will say, like, I will still be generous and nice and give Avatar: The Way of the Water the thumbs up emoji. With the release of the Whitney Houston biographical film, I Want to Dance with Somebody, being released in theaters, I wanted to watch a movie that I've never seen before, and that is The Bodyguard, which stars Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston, and it's iconic in its own right, but I did read back some of the reviews and looked at the Rotten Tomato score and saw that this movie was not as critically praised back in the day, but has since gotten a cult following over the years, especially among black folks. And of course, everybody who loves Whitney Houston does like that movie. And the only thing I knew about that movie prior to watching it was just the iconic song, I Will Always Love You, which I think it's a good song. It's a good cover, but I'm not too fond of it, especially since I heard it a bunch of times growing up, especially from my own mother. But then I heard some of the other music. I'm like, oh, I know that song. I didn't know that came from that movie. Like I'm Every Woman and I Have Nothing, which now is my favorite Whitney Houston song. But the movie itself, it's clear that movie was tailor-made for Whitney Houston. But her and Kevin Costner, they do have good chemistry, and they stitched it together with a hackney story, and it did work. So, but The Bodyguard, I'd say, is a pretty decent watch. I rewatched Catch Me If You Can, which is celebrating 20 years, and is a movie I used to watch on TV a lot back in the day for a lot of reasons. Like, one, I am a fan of Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and Leonardo DiCaprio. And this is one of those movies that came out during my formative years that really shaped the types of movies that I'm into, and I guess formed my maturity into movies. But as far as Steven Spielberg goes, there are two types of movies. There's the blockbuster he likes to make, and then there's those movies where he's going for an Oscar, and this is the latter. And though I'm more so a fan of the former, I do like it when Steven Spielberg makes movies like this every now and then. Some of them are ish, but some of them are really good, such as Catch Me If You Can. And Leonardo DiCaprio, he is great in this. Tom Hanks, he's also great in this. I like the chemistry the two of them had together, and I just like the wild goose chase of Leonardo DiCaprio just forging checks, and then Tom Hanks catching wind of this and just trying to convince him, like, to just stop, and then eventually he stops, and just, you have to watch the film for yourself. And I just like the style of it, especially since it takes place in, like, what, the 50s, 60s, something. It takes place in the 60s and then going into the 70s. And so Catch Me If You Can, well, the only negative I had towards the film is that it is slow at some parts, but hey, the movie did introduce us to Amy Adams, so I'm gonna give Catch Me If You Can the hard eyes emoji, and happy 20th anniversary. So over the past couple of days, I watched Die Hard, the original one, starring Bruce Willis and the late Alan Rickman. Rest in peace. But I wanted to watch it because, you know, there's always been that debate about whether or not it's a Christmas movie or not. Personally, I don't think it's a Christmas movie. Do I think it's a movie that takes place on Christmas? Yes. It's still an awesome action movie. You can watch this movie at any point of the year and it will not feel off. But watching this movie with adult eyes, because I haven't seen any of the movies since I'll probably say since I was a teenager, because I remember that first one, it was my dad's favorite action movie of all time. And even then I liked it, but watching it with adult eyes, this movie just ages like fine wine, because not only is it an awesome action movie, but Joe Turnan's direction in this movie is just perfection. Just the subtleties, the layers. John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, is a relatable action hero. Hans Gruber, he's just one of those charismatic villains that just works. He was a joy to watch. And oh, again, rest in peace, Alan Rickman. This is definitely one of your iconic performances before Professor Snape in Harry Potter. But Die Hard, and look, again, I still don't think it's a Christmas movie, but even if you still decide to watch it on Christmas, it's not a bad idea at all, because even watching this around the Christmas time, it just felt right. And yeah, I really like Die Hard. It's one of my favorite action movies of all time, and it definitely aged well. So after I rewatched Die Hard, I said, why not stop there? Why not just revisit the rest of the series? Though I just decided to revisit the Die Hard series when it was a trilogy. I'm going to watch the 4th movie in January, and then the 5th shitty movie in February, in honor of that movie's anniversary, even though it doesn't deserve that type of recognition. But hey, and besides, I got other things I'm trying to watch right now. But Die Hard 2, Die Harder, is the epitome of a action movie that is just kind of half-assed. I mean, it's still entertaining to watch. It's a fun movie to have on in the background while you're getting stuff done, and you can look up every now and then. But otherwise, yeah, I'm just not too fond of this movie. Now, granted, it's not the worst one. We'll get to that one eventually, but Die Hard 2 is definitely a case of sequelitis. And so, in fact, I want to ask y'all, what is that one sequel where you think, awesome movie? Sequel, and to me, that's what Die Hard 2 is. So, hey, if Die Hard 2 is a case of sequelitis, Die Hard with a Vengeance is the true sequel to Die Hard. And it's because Joe McTiernan came back, because it was a different person that made Die Hard 2, but Joe McTiernan, he came back, and it definitely shows in this movie, from the writing to the action. John McClane, he goes up against the brother of Hans Gruber, Simon Gruber, played by Jeremy Irons, a year after he voiced Scar in The Lion King. But Jeremy Irons, he is just as good in this movie as his brother in the first movie. They are both charismatic and a joy to watch, and I just like that back and forth between him being on the phone and giving all these riddles and threats and everything. And I also just like the dynamic and chemistry between Bruce Willis and Sam Jackson, who's also in this movie a year after Pulp Fiction came back. And it's just a joy to watch the two of them trying to work together. And Sam Jackson, he's just a racist against white people, which is hilarious in itself. But Die Hard with a Vengeance is a worthy sequel to that first movie. It's the best of the Die Hard sequels, in my opinion. For its 10th anniversary, I rewatched Django Unchained, which is not only one of my favorite movies of all time, but one of my favorite actually my second favorite Quentin Tarantino film of all time. And when I rewatched this, I was like, fuck yes. I forgot how much I love this movie. To me, this is peak Quentin Tarantino. Just that intro alone with the Django theme, I rewatched that twice. But I just like the revenge thriller of it, and just only Quentin Tarantino could have made a movie like this about a slave that breaks free, and he goes on a revenge quest to save his wife. And as Charlemagne the God said, it is one of his favorite slave movies of all time, and my favorite slave movie of all time. And why? Because Django were no victim. He went in, he burned down the slave plantation, killed all the slave masters, killed all the house niggas, and rode off into the sunset with Kerry Washington. That is a very, very happy ending to me. And even the performances alone, from Jamie Foxx, of course, Kerry Washington, which she is a victim, but she is a relatable victim. You're just rooting for her to be reunited with Django. And then Christoph Waltz, Leonardo DiCaprio, my favorite Leonardo DiCaprio performance. Talk about Leonardo DiCaprio since I just rewatched Catch Me If You Can. But this was the movie that made me go, oh, he's not just Hollywood Golden Boy. He is a legit actor. And then, of course, Samuel Jackson, where he plays the house Negro in the movie, and he's kind of like the second villain of the movie. This movie is just good in all the right ways, bloody in all the fun ways, fun in all the right ways. This movie just works. It is a masterpiece, and that is why I'm giving Django Unchained the hands up emoji, because it is, of course, a masterpiece. God, I love this movie. With Glass Onion hitting Netflix this weekend, I wanted to revisit Knives Out, which was one of my favorite movies of 2019, and I didn't get a chance to watch Glass Onion when it was in theaters for a brief moment during the Thanksgiving holiday. And plus, I just knew it was going to hit Netflix, so I say, hey, I'll just wait for Netflix. But as for Knives Out, this movie aged well, even 3 years later. And Rian Johnson's attention to detail in this movie is immaculate, because this is one of those movies that, like, even though you figure out the mystery, you can still watch it multiple times and see like how we got up to the point where we find out who the killer was. And the performances alone from Ana de Armas, Chris Evans, Daniel Craig, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Christopher Plummer, rest in peace. But the mystery itself is the selling point, and I'm sorry, I'm just amazed at how this movie aged well. And shout out to Rian Johnson for this movie too, because I said this before when I saw this movie back in 2019. This movie proves that Rian Johnson, he is at his best when he's working on his own things instead of working on a big franchise like Star Wars. And even 5 years later, I still don't get why people hate on Rian Johnson like he only did The Last Jedi and that was the worst thing he did. I'm like, because like people want to give Rian Johnson shit for The Last Jedi, but they also forget that he made movies like Looper and Knives Out. So I don't understand you fans. But hey, as for Knives Out, if you've never seen this movie, I highly recommend it, and especially rewatch it leading up to Glass Onion, just to give yourself a little refresher. Glass Onion is the sequel to Knives Out, which is yet another murder mystery by Rian Johnson, in which Daniel Craig returns as Benoit Blanc, who is the returning character from Knives Out. And I just like how he's basically the connective tissue with these movies. But in any case, Benoit Blanc, he comes in solving a new mystery in which he was unintentionally invited to, and he has this group of people like Edward Norton, Janelle Monáe, Kate Hudson, Catherine Hahn, Leslie Odom Jr., Jessica Henwick, and a bunch of others, even Dave Bautista. But basically, something happens, and now he has to solve it. But what I like most about this movie is the non-linear aspect of it. Now, some people prefer this movie over the first movie. I still prefer the first movie, but I still think that this one is just as good as that first movie. But again, what I like about this movie compared to the first movie is the non-linear aspect of it. Because it's like, it starts out one way, but then it shifts back a couple of days earlier, and then you start to see like, okay, this is everything that happens that leads back to this point in time. So you just got to see it for yourself. And once again, Rian Johnson, he continues to show why he is a very immaculate filmmaker, and I don't understand why these toxic Star Wars fans, they just continue to know him for The Last Jedi and not all the other things. Just watch this movie and you will see Rian Johnson, he is a very competent filmmaker. Glass Onion, definitely worth the watch. It's on Netflix. It was in theaters for like almost a week back in November, but then weeks later they finally decided to dump it on Netflix, and definitely worth the watch. Hands up emoji, because Glass Onion, like the first film, is a masterpiece. Another Christmas pick of mine that is also celebrating 30 years is also The Muppet Christmas Carol. And, you know, I'm a sucker for the Muppets. I like the Muppets here and there, but I think this is probably my second time watching A Muppet Christmas Carol. I watched it, I think, once back when I was in middle school, but haven't seen it since. And I don't really watch much Muppet content, well, as far as movies goes. But anyways, Muppet Christmas Carol, definitely a good little Christmas vibey type movie. And Michael Caine, he's one of those actors where he's not above anything, but he's not below anything either. And that definitely shows in this movie. He takes the material seriously while also adding to the hilarity and insanity of the Muppets. And of course, you got your regulars like Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, Gonzo, who's the narrator, Rizzo the Rat. It's just a joy to watch them. I just like it when Muppets, they put themselves in stories that have been told dozens of times, and A Christmas Carol is definitely a good one. So Muppet Christmas Carol, definitely a good watch to watch around Christmas time. With The Best Man final chapters coming out in a few weeks, I wanted to revisit those first two movies, starting with that original classic from the late 90s, The Best Man. And of course, like over the years, I've rewatched The Best Man Holiday, not only because that movie surprised me, but because it's a good holiday movie. But I just never went back to rewatch that first movie until like 9 years ago, prepping for that movie. But The Best Man, I even remember 10 years ago, I liked that movie a lot more, even with adult objective eyes. But watching it even now with even more adult objective eyes, this movie just works. And of course, it's a black film, but it's a film that is accessible to anybody. And I'm telling you, it's about all these college friends just getting together for a wedding, and then everybody's dirty laundry airs out, and it all falls into this one weekend, and then it all comes together. And of course, you got Tay Diggs, Morris Chestnut, Harold Perrineau, Terrence Howard, Melissa DeSouza, Nia Long, Sanaa Lathan, Monica Calhoun. The black star power in this movie is over 9,000! And I love every minute of it, and I just love the interactions between all the characters. And the actors definitely hold this movie together. And lastly, Malcolm D. Lee, who made this and other movies, and including the sequel to this movie, he was the right person for this. Like, he put his heart and soul into this movie. The Best Man, yeah. The Best Man Holiday, which is the sequel to The Best Man, it takes place a little over a decade later or after that first movie, and it's about all of them getting together for this holiday. And of course, Lance, played once again by Morris Chestnut, and his wife Mia, she is dying, so everybody doesn't know, but they all get together for the holiday, for what could be her last holiday. And so she inspires everyone to make amends after everything that happened in that first movie. And of course, all the black star power returned in this movie, and they did not miss a beat as these characters. What I love about this movie is that it's basically a continuation of that first movie, and we basically see these characters, who they are and what they are 10 years later, and that just works for this movie. I remember 10 years ago, I was a little pessimistic, because it's like, that's when I was on my Hollywood is running out of ideas mindset. But then I saw this and thought, oh, this is actually good. Like, to me, this is one of those sequels that actually stands with that first movie. So The Best Man Holiday, not only a great movie, but a great holiday movie. So I finally finished The Best Man final chapters, which is basically Malcolm D. Lee continuing the story of these characters from the Best Man series, in which it is an 8-episode mini-series, and we follow these characters after the events of The Best Man Holiday, and we get to see where these characters are post those events, especially with Lance. He's still grieving the loss of Mia, and he goes to different places throughout this series, but also Harper's relationship with his wife is tested. We get to see the next chapter of Jordan, played by Nia Long, and then we get to see Terrence Howard. He's the one that gets married. But overall, I feel like this show is basically just 2 movies crammed into one miniseries, because I feel like Malcolm D. Lee, he had an idea for a third movie, but then that never really materialized, and then some years went by and they got more ideas for it. But then the pandemic happened, and then Universal, they got their own streaming service, Peacock, and then Peacock is just, they're just looking for content to put on there because they're losing the streaming wars, and so they just like, all right, what do we got? And then they went to Malcolm D. Lee, like, oh, you got some more content for The Best Man? Let's make it. But then Malcolm D. Lee, it just seemed like he just, shoot, I got all these ideas. Shoot, I'll just put it all in a miniseries, and there we go. But regardless, like I said about The Best Man Holiday, I like that it was more so a continuation of those characters from that first movie, and that's what this miniseries does. Though some of their story arcs work, some of their story arcs I'd say don't necessarily work. Some of them just takes a turn that I didn't quite expect, but regardless, again, it all wrapped up. I say their story arcs wrapped up in a nice little bow, and you'll leave satisfying. And yeah, so I give The Best Man final chapters the hard eyes emoji. The Santa Claus is just wrapped, which is a new series on Disney Plus, and it is based off of the Santa Claus trilogy from back in the day, and Tim Allen returns as Santa Claus, as well as some others from those movies. And in this show, he hands the jacket off to Cal Penn's character because he's a little tired of Santa Claus now. that plot point is a little redundant, but I do like what they did with Santa Claus and his new family. I do like his kids on the show. I like that, we get to, it's a bit of a fish out of water story. I just wish that they had stuck with that plot point just a little bit longer. We get to see him out of his element, especially since he's been Santa Claus for decades now, and so we get to see him reintegrated into the real world. And I do also like the extension of the North Pole, and we get to see the elves, and well, except for that one little black elf, I like to call him Santa's little house Negro elf, but hey, overall, I did enjoy the show. I just wish that there were certain plot points I wish that they had stuck with a little bit more, but hey, I think it's getting a second season, so hopefully they can get more than 6 episodes. So it's a good little holiday show to watch with the family, and it's a great little extension of the Santa Claus trilogy. And I feel like any show that is based off of an already pre-established movie series, the best thing it can do, which is what Cobra Kai does, which is just be a continuation of that series and not do anything else, also honor and respect what had came before, but also adding something new. So the Santa Clauses, pretty solid show. I highly recommend it. As a Christmas gift, I recently took my mother to go see I Want to Dance with Somebody, the Whitney Houston biopic, which is a movie I have been anticipating, and she's a huge fan of Whitney Houston as well. And so this movie I say I'm approaching this movie a little bit differently, because biopics, there have been good ones and there have been some half-assed ones, and in the case of Whitney Houston is an interesting subject, because of course you don't need me to tell you that she's one of the greatest voices of her generation, but everybody knows that she was a troubled human being, and ever since her death back in 2012, she's been the subject of many series, made-for-TV movies or shows and documentaries about her life, and especially about her and her relationship with Bobby. And, there's a lot of finger-pointing going on as to who's to blame for her downfall. Some fingers point at her family life, some fingers point at Bobby Brown, some fingers point at Whitney Houston herself. But whatever the case may be, I say the best thing about this movie is like, it pretty much just has a checklist of things. So like, all right, how she got started, how she got started singing, her rise to fame, and her relationship with Bobby. Just has a checklist of things that everybody knows. And of course, everybody knows how troubled of a life she was and her drug addiction. But the movie, it highlights it highlights Whitney as an artist and the impact she made as a singer. And I say that's the best thing about this movie. Even though I wish this movie didn't really, it mentioned it, but it just really danced around all the negative aspects of her life. I just wish they elaborated on it a little bit. But regardless, I do appreciate that this movie was more so a celebration of Whitney Houston's music. And so for that, I'm going to give I Want to Dance with Somebody the thumbs up emoji. Antwone Fisher is celebrating 20 years. Which is the directorial debut of Denzel Washington, and what a great debut it was. I remember I used to watch this all the time when I was younger. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's one of the few movies that my late father cried at, and I even get teary-eyed watching it a few times, especially at the end where he meets his family. But what makes it such a good movie, especially for a directorial debut for Denzel, is that it was essentially a character study about a man that went through a lot in his life, and everything's just weighing down on him until he gets some help from Denzel Washington's character, who is a therapist, and he finally learns to overcome all that trauma, and he goes to meet his family, and then it all pays off in the end, and all that would not work if it wasn't for the direction of Denzel Washington, a great performance by Denzel Washington, and of course, a great performance by the title character, Antwone Fisher, played by Derek Luke. This movie just works, and further proof of why men need to go to therapy. And if you have not seen Antwone Fisher, I highly recommend you watch it. This is one of those gems that just aged well with time. Happy 20th anniversary, Antwone Fisher. Drumline was released 20 years ago, and of course I revisited it, and by the end of rewatching it, I just got real nostalgic just listening to the credits and just the overall movie, because I remember my older sister, she used to be in the band, but she didn't play an instrument, but she was on the color guard. And I just remember being there with my parents at every band competition. And then, of course, I play the drums. And so that movie holds a special place in my heart. But overall, it's just an overall good story about this hot-head kid that is good at what he does, but also needs to learn what it means to be part of the band and knowing that it's all about him. And it's also anchored by great performances from Nick Cannon, what I think is his best movie. And of course, Orlando Brown, after seeing him at BlurCon over the summer, I respect his craft as an actor more, and just watching him work in this movie, I just appreciate him even more. And then even Zoe Saldana in one of her earlier performances, just this movie, it just stands the test of time on so many levels. From the music, the direction, the production, just happy 20th anniversary drumline. So last year, I rewatched the Lord of the Rings trilogy in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Fellowship of the Ring. And so now this year, in honor of the 10th anniversary of The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, and by extension, the Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, I decided to pretty much marathon the entire Hobbit trilogy over the weekend, starting with An Unexpected Journey, which I felt was, I remember 10 years ago, I liked it but didn't love it, and it just didn't have that spark that the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, nor that it should. In fact, I put the Lord of the Rings with Star Wars. It's like that it has an original trilogy of movies where you're never going to be able to replicate what that original trilogy was able to accomplish, especially with the Lord of the Rings. But with the first edition of The Hobbit, The Unexpected Journey, I felt like in the beginning it was a little slow getting going, but then halfway through it, that's when the movie really started to pick up and you really started to get invested. Martin Short, he's a great young Bilbo Baggins. Great seeing Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and all the dwarves and all the other returning characters from the Lord of the Rings. They added to the story, and just a great addition to the lore. And hey, and it's also a great palate cleanser for the Rings of Power. The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, I say is probably my favorite of the Hobbit trilogy because of Smaug. Benedict Cumberbatch plays the voice of Smaug, and just that whole sequence is worth the price of admission. But everything else leading up to that is like the movie found its pace, and it really got going, and there was not a dull moment. So, The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug. Great middle entry in the trilogy. The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, is where this really proves that this series really should have just been 2 movies instead of 3. But you know, the studio, they wanted to make a trilogy out of this. All that said, I kind of like The Battle of the Five Armies. Though the the titular battle at the end, the climax of the movie, I feel kind of dragged on just a little bit. But I feel like everything that this trilogy has been building up to led to this, and how it brought everything else together, and how it ties into the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. I felt like it was a great, satisfying conclusion, as well as, at the time, a great little send-off for the Lord of the Rings until we got Rings of Power. But yeah, we all know how that went. But the Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, great. So, season 2 of The Mighty Ducks Game Changers just wrapped last week, and of course, me being a fan of the Mighty Ducks trilogy, I watched it, and while it's not as good as the first season, I still felt like it was a fun little season. Like, what I liked about it is that it was self-contained. It didn't rely on nostalgia or any other characters. I mean, there is a cameo from the Bash Brothers. Yes, fuck yes. But other than that, like, it's still an entertaining and good enough show to recognize and respect where it came from. It still recognizes and respect where it came from with the original Mighty Ducks trilogy, while also bringing something new with the newer characters and also progressing those new characters. And Josh Duhamel was a great addition to the Mighty Ducks universe. So season 2 of the Mighty Ducks Game Changers, worth the watch.